Today, on this episode of The Crossover, we will be discussing the New York Times best-selling book, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, with world-renowned psychiatrist and Stanford professor Dr. Anna Lembke. Find out how to moderate compulsive overconsumption in a dopamine-overloaded world. Much more on this episode of The Crossover. Good afternoon, everyone. Going to be talking with Dr. Lembke today from Stanford about Dopamine Nation. Super interesting topic and a best-selling book. There we go. Hey.
Should I hang up the other phone?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. All right. So let me see where to put this thing.
Perfect. Well, I'm glad it worked out, Anna. It's a pleasure to have you on. I hope that wasn't too difficult.
Well, actually, it was. It was your assistant, whose name I can't remember, was great, and he walked me through it. So that was good.
Perfect. Well, just while everyone's logging on, I'm going to do a brief introduction. We have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Ann Lembke today. She is a New York Times bestselling author, chief of addiction medicine, and professor of psychiatry at Stanford University. Anna is a clinical scholar. She's published over 100 peer-reviewed papers, book chapters, and commentaries. She sits on the board of several state and national addiction-focused organizations. She has testified before various committees in the U.S. House of Representatives and Senate, keeps an active speaking calendar, and maintains a very busy clinical practice. As background, in 2016, she published Drug Dealer MD, How Doctors Were Duped, Patients Got Hooked, and Why It's So Hard to Stop, which was highlighted in the New York Times as one of the top 5 books to read regarding the opioid epidemic. Dr. Lembke was also recently featured on the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. It's an amazing documentary if anyone hasn't seen it, looking at the impact of social media on our lives. And today's interview is going to be focused on her latest book, which is a New York Times bestseller, Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence. Really explores how to avoid compulsive overconsumption in a world that is overloaded with dopamine addiction. So again, Anna, thanks for being here. Really a pleasure to speak with you.
Well, my pleasure. This is an exciting opportunity for me to be on Instagram, which I've never done before.
Well, listen, I'm going to start just by talking about what was your impetus to write this book? It's such a novel idea and a novel topic, I think. But what was your impetus to write this book?
Well, there were a couple threads that came together. One, I was seeing increasing numbers of people coming in with addictions to various digital drugs, online pornography, online shopping, social media, video games. And these were folks who were generally saying that it was the advent of the smartphone that really tipped them over the edge into addictive use. At the same time, I was reflecting on a period in my own life where I feel like I really got addicted to romance novels. That was facilitated by an e-reader. So the digitization of books, when I got a Kindle, I went from being, an intermittent romance novel reader to being a chain reader, staying up late at night, reading in between patients, really kind of a compulsive overuse. And then all that dovetailed really, with my research into the neuroscience of addiction, what's actually happening in the brain, and this realization that, oh my goodness, like the whole world has become drugified and we're now all vulnerable to the problem of addiction. Everything that we do, is now turned into a drug, and we've all become much more vulnerable to this problem of compulsive overconsumption. And I do think that it's contributing to our general unhappiness. Because of the ways that it leads to this dopamine deficit state that really looks a whole lot like depression.
So let's talk a little bit about the title, which is great, Dopamine Nation. First of all, how did you pick it? And then explain, for most people, they've obviously heard the word dopamine, but most people don't actually know what dopamine is. So can you explain a little bit where the title came from and what is dopamine exactly?
Yeah, well, Dopamine Nation is a way to communicate that we are in a really unique point in human history where our technology has allowed us to create infinite access to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors in ways that are unprecedented in human existence. We no longer really have to struggle for basic survival. quite the opposite. We are living in this world of incredible overabundance. And you can really track sort of misery according to wealth of nations. The richer that countries are, the more unhappy people are. And it's really a paradox, because you would think, oh my God, we have all this great stuff, right? Why are we not just like ecstatic? And I think it has to do with the way that we process pleasure and pain, and the way that all of this dopamine has led us actually to be more unhappy. So that's the title of the book. Dopamine is actually a chemical, a neurotransmitter that's made in the brain. It's very important for the experience of pleasure, reward, and motivation. It's also, interestingly, involved in movement. So people who have Parkinson's disease, for example, have a depletion of dopamine in a part of the brain called the substantia nigra. And that's no coincidence that dopamine is involved in both motivation, reward, and pleasure, and also movement, because for most of human existence, if you wanted to get your reward, you had to go get it, right? That's not true anymore, but that's been true for most of the world and time as we know it. So what happens in the brain essentially is that when we do something pleasurable, we release dopamine in a very specific part of the brain called the reward pathway. And the more reinforcing something is, the more dopamine it releases above our baseline tonic level of dopamine firing, which is always there.
So what is a dopamine deficit state? You mentioned that in your book, and you just mentioned it earlier. Just for those, again, who have not read your book, what does that term mean?
Well, basically, what happens in the brain when we do something that's rewarding or pleasurable or reinforcing is we get a little hit of dopamine, right? An increase in dopamine in the reward pathway. But no sooner has that happened than our brains will adapt to that increased dopamine by downregulating dopamine production and dopamine transmission. But our brains do this funny thing. They don't just bring dopamine levels back to baseline, they actually bring it below baseline in an equal and opposite direction to whatever that initial increase was. And that's called the opponent process reaction, and we experience that as the come down or the hangover. With a little passage of time, we eventually start to build up our dopamine levels again, and we're back at baseline. But with repeated exposures to highly reinforcing drugs and behaviors, what happens is that initial dopamine spike gets weaker and shorter in duration, but that after effect into the dopamine deficit state gets stronger and longer. And eventually we kind of end up in that dopamine deficit state. And that's called allostasis, where our brains have adapted to all that dopamine by essentially changing our hedonic or joy set point, so that we end up in a chronic dopamine deficit state. And that's when we're on our way to addiction. Because when we get there, we need more potent forms of our drug, we need more of our drug, and we need it not even to get high, we just need it to get out of that dopamine deficit state and feel normal. And very importantly, when we're not using, we're experiencing the universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance, which are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of wanting to use our drug, otherwise known as craving.
Now, you use the word addiction, and again, people have obviously used that term before. What is the clinical definition of addiction? Because people use it in very differing fashions.
Yeah, so addiction, briefly defined, is the continued compulsive use of a substance or a behavior despite harm to self and or others. So that's like the broadest definition. If you were going to look at the definition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the easiest way to remember those 11 criteria is the 4 C's and the WTFs. And the 4 C's are control, compulsion, craving, and consequences, especially continued use despite consequences. And the WTFs are withdrawal, meaning that we have this syndrome of withdrawal when we try to cut back or stop. Tolerance, meaning that the drug stops working at its current dose, so we need more potent forms or more of it to get the same effect. And the F doesn't stand for anything. It's just an easy way to remember it.
Interesting. And, I think the problem that most people face is that as humans, we're obviously programmed to seek pleasure and to avoid pain.
Yes.
And in this world, as your book says, everything is designed to be more addictive and want you to crave it. So entertainment, gambling, alcohol, social media, drugs. How do you recommend maintaining balance in a world that's full of indulgences? And as human beings, we're programmed to want more of that.
Yeah, well, the first thing that I really want people to wrap their head around is that we can get caught in this vortex of compulsive overconsumption without even realizing it, and that it's very physiological. Because we are programmed, as you said, to approach pleasure and avoid pain. We do that unconsciously. We're wired over millions of years of evolution to do that. So what happens when we get caught in this loop of, compulsive overconsumption, all of this dopamine, our brain's compensating with a dopamine deficit state, we don't even see it for what it is, right? We really have to stop and really be thoughtful and self-aware, and in some ways even kind of give it over to somebody else who might be noticing that they think we have a problem, even if we don't feel like we have a problem. Because addiction is a state in which you can see clearly the problem when you have it. So I think first acknowledging that, and then essentially the first step is abstaining from that drug of choice, whatever it is, for long enough for the body to get the signal that it needs to start upregulating dopamine again. Because as long as we're getting that fire hose, from an external source, we're going to stay in that dopamine deficit state. But when we stop that, then with enough time, we will start to make our own dopamine. The problem is we will go into withdrawal, right? So I talk about in the book this pleasure-pain balance and how we'll get chronically tipped to the side of pain. So when we first take off from the pleasure side, because there's all this weight, these gremlins on the pain side, we go into withdrawal. So when you do this, what I recommend is 30 days of abstinence or a dopamine fast from whatever our drug of choice is, right? So for me, it was romance novels. For somebody else, it might be sugar. For somebody else, it might be pornography and masturbation. For somebody else, it might be gambling. But the key is to stop for 30 days. Why 30 days? Because 30 days is the average amount of time it takes to reset those dopamine reward pathways. If you do less than that, you basically only get the withdrawal part without the benefit part. You don't get to come out of that space. So, you choose that, whatever that thing is, an app on your phone that you compulsively overuse, or again, a type of food, or maybe it's cannabis, and you just put it away for 30 days. In the first 2 weeks, you will feel terrible. You will experience the universal symptoms of withdrawal, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, craving, intrusive thoughts of wanting to use. But if you can make it to weeks 3 and 4, I swear to you, you will start to feel so much better. And then you'll be able to really enjoy more modest rewards, but also look back on your compulsive use and see it for what it really was, which even if it didn't meet threshold criteria for an addiction, it was probably interfering with the way that you want to spend your time.
Now, you were featured on the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, which for anyone who hasn't seen it, absolutely fantastic documentary. And it focuses upon social media and how powerful that addiction is. Why is the addiction to social media so powerful, and why is it many times almost unbreakable?
So we are wired to connect with other humans. Right. So for millions of years of evolution, again, we were meant to be in social groups. Why? Because we can find mates that way. We can protect ourselves from predators. We can steward scarce resources. We are wired to connect. And in fact, one of the ways that our brains gets us to connect is by releasing dopamine when we make those human connections. What social media has done is essentially drugified the experience of human connection. It's made it possible to make these connections and simulate intimacy with no effort. So if you think about the way that traditionally we've had to make human connections, first of all, you have to go outside and meet people, right? And a lot of the people that you meet aren't going to be like these spectacular, wonderful, scintillating, interesting people. They're going to be kind of average people like you and me. But now, just sitting on your couch, you can explore a world of millions of people. You can swipe right, you can swipe left. A lot of these personas are curated. You don't get to see like people's real lives. And you can simulate that feeling of connection, especially if it's enumerated with likes or rankings, which dopamine is really sensitive to. And if it's uncomfortable or you don't like the interaction, you can just leave it. If it's boring, you can go somewhere else. So what happens is that we're not at some point really making deep human connections. What we're doing is just pursuing, more hits of dopamine.
I mean, people have said that based on the social media with Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and all that, that just like you said, people are so isolated. Do you feel like these technologies have eroded the fabric of society?
So here's the bottom line about addiction. It makes people retreat from social connection because the drug itself comes to substitute for intimacy and those human connections. So I think, what in my book, I open with a patient of mine who developed a very serious sex addiction, and he ended up building his own masturbation machine. And I do that, I call that opening chapter Our Masturbation Machines, because in many ways, these devices have become the ways in which we auto-stimulate ourselves, right? We get all of our needs met here. We get our intellectual needs, we get our social needs, we get our sexual needs. Like, we don't even have to go out and find people anymore, right? We can just use the device. So I think it's really, I'm not saying this is all bad. I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff that happens online, including on social media, but we have to really be honest with ourselves that there is this deep dark side, and we have to temper our use. So, a little bit of alcohol, with friends is an okay thing. Too much alcohol, we would all agree, is bad. And it's the same thing with these digital drugs. A little bit is okay, but if you're, all day, every day, and you're not doing anything else, then you've tipped the balance to the dark side.
Now, another very controversial topic is social media, phone use, and children, right? So you want your kids to be tech savvy. You want your kids to have connections with friends and have a phone so you can contact them. But obviously, there's a risk that your kid is on the phone all day, not playing with friends, not getting exercise, not playing sports. What's your advice to parents with young kids and the use of the phone?
So I really strongly advise families and caregivers not to give a child under the age of 10 their own device. And any screen time should be monitored. You should know what your kid is doing online, and you should limit the amount of time that they're online. Quantity and frequency matter, and the more we're exposed to a drug, the more likely we are to get addicted to a drug. And we have to really conceptualize screens as drugs. Screens in and of themselves are highly reinforcing. The lights, the flickering images, it's all just like exactly what our brains want. So super, super important to monitor and restrict and not give your kid a device, and also really build up the in real life coping skills like sports, like being outdoors, like negotiating and learning and playing games, in real life. By the way, not just parents, but also schools have a responsibility here. Schools need to really emphasize tech-free spaces. What's happened, unfortunately, is a lot of schools have abdicated their teaching responsibility. They just put kids in front of screens because, it's easy to do. So this is not just the responsibility or role of individual caregivers. This is really a collective societal problem that needs to be tackled both from a top-down and bottom-up intervention. So I think that's really important. And then a lot of discussions about the addictive potential of online drugs, essentially. The ways in which, and I encourage parents to talk transparently about the way we ourselves are struggling with this, right? Like, I talk to my kids, like, I'll be like, once I start watching YouTube or TikTok, you have to like drag me away. Like, someone has to come and bring a hook, and like, it's hard for me, right? And I know exactly what's happening in the brain, and it's still really, really hard. I can't watch TikTok. Once I start on TikTok, hours and hours could pass, right? So I think having those open discussions with our kids, like, wow, isn't it amazing? You lose time. You're completely absorbed. It's such a comfort. And yet, even when you get to a point where you don't want to do it anymore, you can't stop. Why is that? It's because you're trying to avoid that dopamine free fall, right? That dopamine deficit state, which feels like, anxiety, depression, restlessness. So I think these kinds of open discussions, and then just continually doing experiments with dopamine fasting, maybe once a week taking a digital Sabbath, right? From Friday night to Sunday morning, nobody in the family is going to use devices. We're going to go on a hike. We're going to play cards. We're going to play board games. So being really intentional about limiting the quantity, the frequency, and creating these tech-free spaces. and having the conversations.
Now you're talking about current social media being difficult to control. Now we got the metaverse coming, which people
Right.
say is social media on steroids.
Right.
What's your opinion about the metaverse? That's going to just annihilate everyone's addiction, and just meaning it's going to be a much stronger addiction.
Yeah, I mean, so here's what happens as people get addicted. They need more of their drug and more potent forms of their drug in order to overcome tolerance. And so, like, for example, video games is a great, Pac-Man once upon a time was this amazing, interesting, fun thing. Now, nobody would play Pac-Man, right? Because we've all built up our tolerance. And so the worry with the metaverse is, yeah, as we get these totally immersive kinds of worlds, that we're basically going to get more and more addicted, more and more tolerant. And then what will happen is that in these worlds, the worlds themselves will become more boring. So then we're going to have to do more and more radical, outrageous things in the worlds, things involving sex and violence, and just like things that are not socially, consistent with our collective values. And that's really scary because, of course, there will be the feeling that there are no consequences for those things, but there are real consequences in terms of the erosion of our sort of collective notions of what's good and what's bad. So I think it's really, I think, again, there may be some really important and useful aspects of the metaverse that could be applied in productive and helpful ways. But the longer we spend on there, the less we're investing in our real life. And the less we're investing in our real life, honestly, the less interesting it is. And then the more compelling the metaverse is. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. I just really urge people to spend time in real life with real other people, with devices not present, and try to rekindle what is so incredible about the world that we live in if we just pay attention to it.
Now, there's been a lot of controversy over the last 5 or 6 years looking at who should be patrolling social media, right? These companies are mega, they're massive, they kind of do what they want. People have tried to put kind of regulations on social media for these very issues that you're talking about. If you were in charge, how would social media run?
So the thing about addiction in general is that even people with severe addiction are price sensitive. As a drug gets more expensive, they will use less of it or convert to some other drug. What we have with social media is not only that it's highly potent, highly addictive, but it's also limitless, like infinite quantity, and it's free. How could we not get addicted to a drug like that? Like if you had an infinite quantity of free cocaine, there'd be a lot more people addicted to cocaine. So we have to think about the financial incentives that are driving it. Right now, the way that social media companies make money is through advertising. So maybe we need to totally rethink advertising and how that's done. And of course, what advertisers want is more engagement on the platform because that's how they get to us. And so, of course, all of the engineering behind the social media is to keep us, tapping and swiping. So I think totally rethinking the financial incentives are going to be really fundamental. The other thing, too, is I think we need to conceptualize these as potential drugs, just like we know that cigarettes are highly addictive and dangerous drugs. We didn't used to know that, by the way. Doctors used to smoke cigarettes themselves with patients, right? It was all like, no, cigarettes don't cause lung cancer. It's just lung cancer, arising. It sort of teased off cancer that would happen anyway. All kinds of explanations. Now we know that's totally false. And so what happened with cigarettes was 3 things that vastly reduced cigarette smoking in the United States. The first one was that we didn't let companies advertise to younger people. That was huge. Second was that we educated people about the real risks of cigarettes. And then number 3, cigarettes were taxed, so they were a lot more expensive. And once people were having to pay $11, $12, $13 for a pack of cigarettes, cigarette smoking went down. So I think if we conceptualize a lot of these digital drugs as having the serious potential for addiction, and we, tax it in some way or change the financial incentives, if we don't let it be accessed by minors, who don't have the frontal lobe ability to manage that, and and we educate people.
I mean, now let's go back to being obsessed and addiction. And is there a positive role in that? Like, for example, people like Tom Brady, Elon Musk, Michael Jordan. These are people that are obsessed and addicted to being the best at their craft. And over time, they actually have achieved being the best at their craft. Is that a positive or is that a negative? What are your thoughts on that?
I think probably ultimately it's very mixed, and I'm guessing the experience for them as individuals living on the planet is also very mixed, and their achievements are mixed for us. I mean, so we there. In other words, there are certain types of addictions we that are socially acceptable and even socially celebrated, and sort of capitalist achievement is certainly one of them. But I think that anything taken to an extreme like that, there are costs to the individual, costs to society, and costs to our planet.
Huh. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it really depends on who you ask, essentially,
Right.
as to whether or not it's positive or negative. And a lot of the negatives you never hear about.
Right.
Do you feel like addiction varies by culture and by country? So are we in the US more prone to this overconsumption as opposed to someone who's potentially in a third world country?
Right. So if you look at sort of epidemiologic studies looking at addiction, rates of addiction, what you see is that rates of addiction are going up all over the world and are going up highest in rich nations. And this, again, has to do with this whole idea of dopamine nation and overabundance. So it's very clear that the more people have, the more likely they are to get addicted. I also think that there's a lot of variation country to country based on simple access. So one of the biggest risk factors for getting addicted is whether or not you have easy access to that drug. So in the United States, we're struggling with a serious opioid epidemic that was sparked by easy access to opioids through doctors' prescriptions, right? And it's now morphed into heroin and illicit fentanyl. In other countries, they're not facing that, but, for example, in Russia, they have a huge alcohol addiction problem because that's their culture and they have more access. I do think in general, what you see historically is that capitalism drives addiction, and that the dark side of capitalism, which works so well in terms of encouraging human achievement, that the dark side of capitalism is really then this kind of compulsive overconsumption at the limits of that.
Now, I'm going to ask you this is our final question because I know you're so busy, but where do you see this going in the next 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, in a world where everything is becoming more and more drugified, more and more convenient, people become addicted much more readily? Where do you see this going in the future?
Well, it's a great question. I think, I'm ultimately an optimist. I think humans are adaptable. I think this is the biggest public health crisis that we're going to be facing for the next 100 years. But I'm optimistic that we're going to figure it out. But we do need to figure it out. And by that, I mean we need to basically limit and manage our overconsumption. If we continue to consume the way that we're consuming now, we're going to titillate ourselves to death, which we're already doing. 70% of the world's global deaths are due to diseases caused by modifiable risk factors like overeating, inactivity, and smoking. We have more obese people in the world today than we have people who are malnourished. That is unprecedented. So we've got to figure out how to live in this world of overabundance. And I basically hold up people in recovery from addiction as modern day prophets for the rest of us for how to do that, because they have figured out, as a matter of sheer survival, how to kind of manage their addictions, and they have a lot to teach the rest of us, and that's essentially what my book is about.
Anna, just an amazing interview, kind of great learning points for all of us. The world is a crazy place. It's only getting crazier. It's only getting crazier, so you just have to maintain balance. For those of you who have not bought the book, Dopamine Nation, amazing read, buy it. Anna, thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend.
You're very welcome. And this was exciting for me to be on Instagram.
I was going to say, are you going to be addicted now to Instagram?
No, as soon as this is over, your assistant is going to help me take it off my phone. Because
we're going to get you all followers. You're going to have thousands of followers. This is how it starts.
I mentally can't handle it. I really can't.
This is how it starts, Anna. This is how it starts.
You're not helping me.
Listen, take care. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Take care.